A Viking swore an oath to a dying empire, and that empire had been engineering this moment for 700 years. His name was Leif. At least, that's what the Byzantines called him. He had come from the north, from the fjords, the rivers, the open steppe. He had never seen walls this high, never seen a church this large, never felt this foreign in his life. But Cherson had been waiting for him. Because Cherson always waited for its enemies. It had one purpose for them. To turn them into soldiers. And what it did to life, it had already done to every army, every empire, every conqueror that had ever appeared on its horizon. The city on the cliff didn't fight back. It never needed to. It simply waited and transformed whoever came through its gates into exactly what it needed them to be. This is the story of how a city no one wanted to rule outlasted every empire that tried to own it. Stand at the edge of the Heraclean Peninsula and you understand immediately why someone built a city here. To the north, open steppe, flat, windswept, dangerous. The kind of landscape that produces cavalry armies the way rain produces rivers. To the south and west, the Black Sea, which the Greeks called the Euxine, the hospitable sea, though hospitable was always more aspiration than description. And here, on a limestone plateau that drops sharply into the water below, is a natural fortress that requires very little help from human hands. The Greeks who founded Chersonesos in the 5th century BC understood this. They built their city on a cliff. They oriented their streets in a grid. They grew grain in the thin soil of the peninsula and traded it north into the barbarian interior. For nearly 1,000 years before our story even begins, Cherson, as the Byzantines would rename it, had been the place where the civilized world ended and the steppe began. By 300 AD, it had already outlived two versions of Greek civilization. It had been absorbed by the Roman Empire. It had survived the crisis of the 3rd century that tore Rome apart. And it had done all of this by being, above everything else, useful. Useful for grain, useful for fish, useful as a listening post on the steppe frontier, useful as a place to exile people you didn't want near the capital. The city knew, in its stones and cisterns and grid-straight streets, how to make itself indispensable. This was the talent it would refine across the next 7 centuries into something approaching an art form. But in 300 AD, Cherson's greatest test hadn't arrived yet. It was still 300 miles away, moving slowly west. And it was called the Huns. The Huns didn't destroy Cherson. This is important. They destroyed almost everything else. In the 370s, a confederation of steppe warriors of unprecedented ferocity swept out of Central Asia, shattered the Ostrogoths, terrified the Visigoths into crossing the Danube, and set in motion the sequence of events that would end with the sack of Rome in 410. The city of Aquileia, once a hub of northern Italian commerce, was leveled so thoroughly that Augustine described it as barely a shadow of itself. The town of Novia Dunum on the Danube simply ceased to exist. Cherson watched all of this from its cliff. The city had something the steppe armies didn't particularly need: walls and a deep water harbor. The Huns operated on horseback. They had no siege tradition. A well-defended coastal city was simply not worth the effort when there was so much softer territory to the west. So Cherson survived and learned something crucial in the process. It learned that its geography was an argument, a permanent, physical argument that required no soldiers to make, no ambassadors to deliver, no gold to sustain. The cliff did the talking. But the Huns' arrival had done something else. It had broken the old steppe order. The peoples who had lived in rough equilibrium north of the Black Sea, trading, raiding, occasionally settling, were now in violent flux. New groups moved into the vacuum: Bulgars, Avars, Khazars. Each of them needed to deal with Cherson. Each of them discovered the same thing: the city was open for business, under specific terms, on its own schedule. The governor who administered Cherson in the late 4th and early 5th centuries, we don't know his name, only his title, had mastered a particular diplomatic posture that his successors would maintain for generations. He was friendly to everyone. He committed to no one. He traded with the steppe kingdoms to the north while remaining technically loyal to the empire to the south. And if Constantinople occasionally complained that Cherson was too cozy with the barbarians, well, Constantinople wasn't the one on the cliff. What mattered was surviving until tomorrow. Tomorrow was coming faster than anyone expected. By the 6th century, something interesting had happened to Cherson's relationship with Constantinople. It had become deeply uncomfortable for both sides, and therefore completely stable. The Emperor Justinian, the same Justinian who built the Hagia Sophia, who reconquered North Africa and Italy, who codified Roman law into the foundation of European legal tradition, had a particular problem with Cherson. The city was part of his empire in the same way that a difficult uncle is part of a family. Technically present, occasionally useful, frequently annoying, impossible to remove. Cherson had its own laws, its own council, its own system of magistrates who answered to Constantinople in theory and to the grain market in practice. It accepted imperial governors, but had a documented habit of expelling the ones it didn't like, sometimes politely, sometimes not. In 711, the city would exile the Emperor Justinian II himself, and then when he managed to reclaim his throne, it faced his revenge with characteristic Chersonian composure. It sent ambassadors. It negotiated. It survived, but beneath the institutional defiance, something genuine was happening. The city was becoming Byzantine in ways that weren't about politics. Its churches were multiplying. Cherson was, according to tradition, the city where Saint Clement of Rome was martyred, thrown into the sea with an anchor around his neck in the 1st century. And the city took this origin story seriously. By the 6th century, it had basilicas. By the 7th, it had a bishop of real influence. The Christianity that had entered Cherson as a political gesture gradually became something the city actually believed. And here is where the story begins to accelerate. Because faith, especially in the medieval world, was infrastructure. A city that shared the same Christianity as Constantinople had a claim on Constantinople's protection. A city that shared Constantinople's Christianity with the pagan peoples of the steppe had something even more valuable. It had a product to sell. The product was God. And in the 9th century, Cherson exported it north, straight into the heart of the Slavic world. The man who carried it was named Constantine. History remembers him as Cyril. In 860, a Byzantine scholar arrived in Cherson on his way to somewhere else. Constantine, not yet Saint Cyril, not yet the man whose name adorns the alphabet used by over 250 million people today, was on a diplomatic mission to the Khazars, the powerful Turkic confederation that controlled the steppe north of the Black Sea. He was going to debate theology with the Khazar Khagan. This was genuinely his job. He was the most brilliant linguist in the Byzantine world, a man who had learned Hebrew, Syriac, and Samaritan by studying with a grammarian in Constantinople, and who had been sent on impossible missions before. He stopped in Cherson to prepare. What he found there changed everything. In the city's library. And Cherson had a library. Because of course it did. Constantine found manuscripts written in a script he had never seen before. Gothic letters. And apparently within weeks, he had taught himself to read them. But more importantly, in Cherson, Constantine encountered the reality of the steppe world in a way that Constantinople's marble corridors had never allowed. He heard Slavic spoken. He understood, with the sudden clarity of a man who thinks in languages, that there was no way to Christianize the Slavic peoples without giving them the words. Not just the faith, the words. Their own alphabet, their own liturgy, their own written language. He sat down and invented one. The Glagolitic script, the precursor to Cyrillic, was developed in Cherson, or partly in Cherson, before Constantine took it north. The details are disputed, as details in medieval history always are, but the city's role is clear enough. It was the laboratory. The place between worlds, the place where a Byzantine genius encountered a Slavic reality and understood that the gap between them could be bridged with grammar. Cherson gave literacy to a quarter of the world. It has never particularly received credit for this. The city rarely received credit for anything. It simply kept providing. Meanwhile, on the steppe to the north, a different kind of transformation was taking place, and it was heading south at speed. They came down the rivers. The Norse expansion of the 9th century is usually told as a westward story. Longships, monasteries, Ireland, Normandy. But there was an eastern current too, running south and southeast along the great river systems of what would become Russia and Ukraine. The Varangians, as the Byzantines called them, from a word that meant something like men of the sworn fellowship, followed the Volga and the Dnieper like roads, trading amber, furs, and slaves for silver and silk. And at the bottom of the Dnieper, where the river emptied into the Black Sea, there was Cherson. The first time Varangians appeared in Byzantine records, they were raiding. In 860, a fleet of perhaps 200 Norse vessels attacked Constantinople itself, an attack so sudden and so terrifying that it became embedded in Byzantine memory as a near apocalypse. The city survived. The raiders withdrew. But the message was unmistakable. There were new actors on the steppe frontier, and they were nothing like the Huns or the Khazars or the Bulgars. They were seafarers. They could appear from the water as easily as from the land. Cherson, on its cliff above its harbor, paid close attention. In the decades that followed, the city developed what its governors must have recognized as its most sophisticated piece of infrastructure yet, a relationship with the Varangians that was neither submission nor conquest. Cherson traded with them. It hired some of them. It baptized a few. It maintained the fiction that they were guests while structuring the reality so that they couldn't leave easily. This was not naive. This was policy. The empire that Cherson served, the Byzantine Empire, still vast, still formidable, still the greatest organized state in the European world, was beginning to feel the strain of its borders. The armies that had reconquered Italy under Justinian were long gone. The themes, the military administrative districts that had reorganized the empire's defenses, were working hard on every frontier simultaneously. On the eastern border, the Arabs, who had taken Syria, Egypt, and North Africa in the 7th century, and showed no signs of stopping. On the northern border, Bulgars, Magyars, and now these Norse river people, Constantinople needed soldiers. Cherson, perched at the intersection of the empire and the steppe, was perfectly placed to supply them. But supply them from where, and how? The answer came from the north, from a city called Kiev, and from a man whose conversion to Christianity would reshape the entire political map of Eastern Europe. Let's be precise about where we are. The year is roughly 980. The Byzantine Empire has survived 700 years of pressure. Cherson has survived by being useful to whoever held power. The Varangian trading networks have knitted the Norse world to the Byzantine world along the river roads of Rus. And, in Kiev, a prince named Vladimir, grandson of the woman the Orthodox Church would later call equal to the apostles, is deciding which religion to adopt, because he has decided that Kiev needs a religion. This is not a spiritual story. It is a political calculation, and Cherson is about to become the place where it happens. Vladimir of Kiev was, by any honest accounting, a man of considerable violence. He had come to power by killing his brother. He had consolidated that power through systematic military campaigns across the Rus territories. He had maintained, according to the chronicle tradition, a harem of several hundred women, and a religious practice that involved human sacrifice at the major Slavic festivals. He was, in short, a successful 10th century ruler, operating by 10th century standards. But by 987, Vladimir had a problem that was bigger than any army. His kingdom was surrounded by empires with coherent religious identities: the Islamic Caliphate to the southeast, the Catholic Latin world to the west, and the Orthodox Byzantine world to the south. A kingdom without a religion was, in this world, a kingdom without a diplomatic identity, without an international framework, without a claim on any of the alliances, trade networks, and dynastic marriages that religion structured in the medieval world. Vladimir sent out envoys. The Tale of Bygone Years, compiled in Kiev in the early 12th century, describes their reports in terms almost certainly legendary, but culturally precise. The Bulgars, who had converted to Islam, cheerless. The Germans, who represented Latin Christianity, acceptable but cold. The Byzantine envoys, who described the liturgy of Hagia Sophia, overwhelmed, unable to tell if they were in heaven or on earth. This is almost certainly a construction, but it contains a real truth. Constantinople had something no other empire could match. It had the most magnificent sustained performance of religious architecture and ritual in the medieval world. It was designed, consciously, deliberately, to persuade exactly the kind of visitor Vladimir's envoys were. Vladimir chose orthodoxy, but he did not choose it for free. He sent word to the Emperor Basil T. I will convert. I will give you 6,000 Varangian warriors for your imperial guard. In return, you will give me your sister Anna in marriage. Basil T., who was fighting a civil war that threatened to end his dynasty, agreed. Then he hesitated on Anna. Vladimir's response was Cherson. In 988 or 989, the sources disagree on the year in a way that tells you something about how quickly things moved. Vladimir of Kiev brought his army to Cherson. It was not a small army. The chronicles describe it arriving by both land and sea, surrounding the city from the limestone plateau to the north and blocking the harbor to the south. Vladimir had siege equipment. He had engineers. He had, in all likelihood, Byzantine defectors in his ranks who could advise on the city's weak points. Cherson had its walls, it had its cisterns, it had its cliff, but it also had, as it always had, a shortage of whatever was needed most. In this case, water. The siege lasted months. The city held. And then, according to a source that may be legendary, but is certainly poetic, a man named Anastasius, a Chersonian, possibly a priest, shot an arrow over the walls into the Varangian camp. The arrow had a message attached. It told Vladimir where the city's water pipes ran underground, feeding the cisterns from outside the walls. Vladimir cut the pipes. The city surrendered. The moment we have been building toward a rise here. Life, our Varangian outsider, walks through Cherson's gates not as a guest this time, not as a traitor, but as a conqueror who will, within weeks, become something else entirely. Because Vladimir took the city, and then he used it to force Basil II to deliver his sister, and Anna arrived in Cherson. And Vladimir, on the cliff above the Black Sea, in a city that had been engineering this kind of transaction for 7 centuries, was baptized. Whether his eyes were failing before the baptism, and were healed by it, as the hagiographic tradition claims, is beyond historical verification. What is verifiable is this. Vladimir returned to Kiev. He threw the statue of Perun, the Slavic thunder god, into the Dnieper. He ordered the mass baptism of Kiev's population in the river, and he returned Cherson to the Byzantine Empire as a wedding gift. The city had been used as a bargaining chip in the most consequential religious transformation in Eastern European history, and it had survived. It always survived. But Leif, and the thousands of Varangians who followed him south after 988, did not go home. They stayed. They became the Varangian Guard, the elite regiment of Norse warriors, who would serve as the Byzantine emperor's personal bodyguard for the next 2 centuries. They stood on the walls of Constantinople. They carved their names in the marble of the Hagia Sophia. Some of those graffiti survive to this day, half-legible Norse letters scraped into the stone by men who had rowed from the fjords to the center of the world. And it had started here, on a cliff above the Black Sea, in a city that knew how to turn anyone into something useful. After 989, Cherson continued. This is almost the most remarkable thing about it. The city that had witnessed the baptism of Kiev's ruling dynasty, that had been the physical location of the event that determined the religious identity of Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Bulgaria, continued as a mid-sized Byzantine provincial city. Its grain market functioned. Its bishop administered. Its walls were maintained. The Varangian Guard became legendary. At the Battle of Chrysopolis in 989, they helped Basil II crush the last of his internal enemies. In Italy, in Bulgaria, in the endless campaigns of Byzantine expansion and contraction, the Norse axe-bearers carved their reputation across 2 centuries of warfare. The sagas remember them. Harald Hardrada, who would later almost take England at Stamford Bridge in 1066, served in the Varangian Guard and wrote a stanza about Constantinople that survives in the Norse tradition. The city of gold, the city of the southern world. That reputation began in Cherson, in the negotiation between Vladimir and Basil, in the baptismal font on the cliff, but empire's end, and the world that Cherson had navigated so expertly, playing Byzantium against the steppe, selling geography and loyalty and God to whoever could pay, was gradually changing in ways the city could not adapt to. The steppe powers of the 11th century were different from those of the 5th, the Pechenegs, the Cumans. These were not the Huns. Satisfied with the soft territories of the West and indifferent to a cliff-top city, these were peoples with a long memory of Cherson's double-dealing, its calculated neutrality, its comfortable relationship with the empire they raided. And in 1204, the event that would eventually doom Cherson happened not on the Crimean cliff but in Constantinople itself, the Fourth Crusade, a military expedition that had started as a response to Muslim power in the Holy Land and transformed, through debt and Venetian commercial calculation, into an assault on the Christian city it was supposed to defend. Sacked Constantinople. The Byzantine Empire fractured. The administrative coherence that had given Cherson its value for 900 years dissolved. The city lasted another century. Then the Mongols. Then silence. Go to Cherson today, to Chersonesus Turcica, as the Ukrainians call it now, on the outskirts of Sevastopol, and you will find ruins, columns standing in the grass, mosaic floors protected under temporary shelters, the outline of a basilica, its walls reduced to knee height, open to a sky the color of hammered bronze. The Black Sea is still there. The cliff is still there. The grid of streets. The same grid the original Greek colonists laid out in the 5th century BC. The same grid that Leif walked in 988 is still legible in the ground, faint as an old scar. The city left behind, in the end, everything it had always traded in. Connection. The Cyrillic alphabet. The Varangian Guard. The Orthodox Christianity of half the Slavic world. Things that had begun in Cherson's market, in Cherson's library, in Cherson's baptismal font, and had spread outward so completely that the city itself became invisible inside them. Leif stood on that wall once, or someone like him stood there, because the specific name doesn't matter, only the fact of the standing, caught between the world he had come from and the empire he had chosen. Behind him, basilicas and cisterns and 700 years of patient survival. Before him, the water, the steppe, the horizon. The city had made him into something it needed. The city always made you into something it needed. That was how it survived. Cherson was a city that had never conquered anything, yet had outlasted almost everything. Next time, we'll visit a place that tried the exact opposite. A city that believed power came solely from tyranny. A city built on violence, which realized far too late that violence is short-lived. If you found this video worth your time, the comments section is where the conversation takes place. We read every single one. Cities of the Dark Ages. We'll be back soon.